academic talk is really the special kind of talk we use when we're engaged in teaching and learning. So it's the kind of language uses that an adult and child would use together when they're building new knowledge, or the adult's transmitting knowledge, or perhaps the child's displaying knowledge that he or she already has. And one of the easier ways to understand this kind of register of language is looking at how it contrasts with another very broad register of language that I call casual talk, and that's the way we use language in everyday social contexts when we're simply going about the business of getting everyday life done and having relationships with other important people in our world. So it's that contrast again. There's this very broad academic talk register, very broad casual talk register. Of course, both of them, as a person develops over their years, will become more differentiated, and you'll have an academic talk register for math and one for history, but at the preschool level, it's a very broad type of register. It's important because academic talk is the currency of the classroom. It's the currency of learning in school. It is the uses of language that underpin later reading comprehension. And reading comprehension, of course, is the absolute backbone of academic success. So it's a critically important register of language use for all children, but not all children come to school familiar with this register. And at this juncture, it really remains part of what is often called the hidden curriculum. The hidden curriculum are the things that are very, very important to success in school, but they're not directly taught. You either pick up on it, or you've already been very exposed to it at home, or you're kind of out of luck. And when children come to school without it, they're going to start out behind the 8 ball. I think the major thing to take away from it is that you don't want to wait until children are school-aged to think about an academic language register. There are a handful of scholars who've become interested in an academic language register with school-aged children. That is too late. If children come into school and they're not familiar with and comfortable with using this register, we know, we have tons and tons of research. If they start behind with these language skills, they're very likely to remain behind. So it isn't something we want to start thinking about in kindergarten, 1st or 2nd grade. In fact, for families where parents have higher education levels, those children will start to be exposed to very early aspects of this academic talk register before they can even talk. And by the time the children are starting to use language themselves, they are already being asked to do things like display their knowledge verbally or whatever. That's very much a part of this register. So they've got a several-year leg up on children. In our discipline, we often talk about children from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds, and they're very overrepresented in the group of children whose parents have lower education levels. So we absolutely don't want to wait. If I may, I think there's a second take-home, and that is that it really is the function of language that drives the features of language, the vocabulary that you use, the syntax that you use, the kind of narrative structure that's required. So we don't want to be thinking in our field as much as we have been, I think, about what's the language form I want to foster here. We want to be thinking with academic talk, what are the cognitive goals I'm trying to achieve with this language use? And those cognitive functions then rather automatically drive the language that's used. And that is in some ways a pretty powerful shift, although it relies on functionalist theories of language development that have been around a long time. I don't think that we've paid enough attention to how critically important that really is. Certainly I've always gravitated toward those theories, but I really had during the time that these ideas were coalescing for me, I really had an absolute aha moment where I ended up kind of restructuring the way I wrote this entire article by first making the kind of highest level of organization be the cognitive features and the social interactive features, and then talking about the language that automatically will be used once those go into play. And that really helped me move way beyond what has been done with academic language. If you look in the literature, the really kind of nascent literature for school-age children, it's generally lists of features of language. And they don't just show up in a vacuum. They show up because the way language works is we use it for a reason. And that's so basic, and yet I don't think we've really, really thought hard enough about what that means when you're using language at home to get daily living done versus you're using language in the classroom to get learning done, or hopefully, you know, with these interventions I'd like to develop over time, you don't even divorce those two. So for example, parents with higher education levels do both all the time. They're going to the grocery store, they're getting the daily living thing of getting groceries to make dinner, but they're walking through the grocery store and it's this opportunity left and right to be teaching their child about the world. So those families are really merging these two registers. And then, as I mentioned before, a lot of other kids are coming to school and they're fine with casual talk. They just haven't had this kind of experience. So if we could kind of move to thinking about the functions, and I don't think it's rocket scientist kind of work. You know, I think families could do this if we explained it to them, explained why it was important, explained how it was going to help their children in school. I've never met a parent ever who didn't want the best for their child in terms of success in school and elsewhere. I really think that they would be capable without having years and years and years and years of education. I really have three directions that I would like to go in. One thing that I think is critically important is that we figure out how to look at how families are already interacting with their children. You know, we've made great gains in the last few decades in becoming more culturally sensitive. Ironically, one of the outcomes of that is we maybe pigeonhole and stereotype people a little bit more than we should. If we know anything at all from the research, it's how much variability there is within different socio-demographic groups. So, for instance, overall, we could say mothers with low education levels are far less likely to provide socialization in academic talk during the preschool years at home with their child. That's based on a central tendency of a group. The research that has been coming out recently shows very dramatically that within even a very low-income group, there's a tremendous range. So one of the assessment things that I am in the process of developing is trying to find out how families are interacting with the child in the daily routines in the home and with the other kinds of activities they engage in with the child. So that's kind of the family piece, and that's where these skills are developed, or certainly can be developed. I'm also very interested, assessment-wise, beginning with preschoolers, to be able to assess and differentiate between their skill with academic talk and their skill with casual talk. So a child who has a language impairment, by definition, will have deficits in any oral language register. What I am seeing and have been reinterpreting a lot of research and doing some myself is there's a whole another very large group of children that have very adequate casual talk skills when they get to school, but very weak academic talk skills. And it's those weak academic talk skills that are not going to support them to their full capacity and their academic achievement. So the third area, so a couple of areas of assessment, the family, the child, him or herself. The third area is really my, where I really want to be going, but some of these steps need to be taken along the way, is developing interventions, and developing interventions that focus on both parents and preschool teachers as the people who spend all the time with the child, and therefore being the people who can best foster the kinds of language skills that will help the child be successful.